Good afternoon. And for those who've been here already the last 2 days, welcome back. We're in for yet more treats today, talking about women. So I'd like to introduce today the Roundtable on Faith-Based Social Movements. We have 3 speakers. They will each speak in turn, and then we'll have questions in the last half hour. All right? So get your question writing hand ready. Our first speaker is Jeane Peracullo. You can read on the sheet, but I'm going to give some highlights so those of you who like to hear this will hear it. She is chair and associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Salle University in Manila. So this is a woman chair in the Philippines in philosophy, and I'm a philosopher, so I know how great that is. So she's done a number of conference presentations and articles dealing with environmental philosophy, feminist philosophy, environmental ethics, feminist theology, triangulation of gender, religion, and postcoloniality, international relations, and relationship between youth, religion, and culture. So a very broad field of research. She's a founding member of the Asian Association of Women Philosophers. Congratulations, that's really great to find one of those things. The international coordinator of the Ecclesia of Women in Asia, which is a forum of Asian Catholic women theologians and pastoral workers. And you can read the rest there. She is going to talk to us about something very interesting.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Larrapin. So my presentation is entitled Catholic Women's Movements in Asia. The Power of Religion in the Public Sphere. According to theologian Enrique Auga, both women and gender as categories are not really taken seriously in the field of politics and religion. Personally, I found the reasons are varied. In the secularization process, women and religion are treated like they belong to the opposite sides, or something to overcome or sweep aside. Religion in post-colonial studies is understood very much as still part of colonization and thus needs to be overcome. And resistance and agency kind of take place within those parameters. However, a growing body of scholarship has emerged in Europe and North America that has acknowledged that instead of the march towards inevitable secularization, the countervailing movement of sacralization is taking place and gaining ground. For sociologist Gracie Tavey, some scholars have already recognized that something very different had happened in other parts of the world, leading to a different modes of theorizing. Moreover, these scholars have accepted the fact that for most people in most parts of the world, to be religious is an integral part of their modernity and not a reaction to it. Indeed, what Davey had said resonates when we take into account the realities in non-Western parts of the world. Anthropology Sarah Mahmoud asks in her seminal work, Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival and the Feminist Subject, what kinds of practices are taking place that have the potential of transforming social and political life? Religion and religious practices do not come to mind as having the potential to transform social and political life. On the contrary, religion seems to be more aligned towards ideological constructs that uphold systemic violence, which are manifested in sexism, nationalism, fundamentalism, racism, ethnocentrism, transphobia, and many more. For this reason, many feminists around the world steer clear of religion. In particular, the Islamic practice of requiring women to wear hijab is seen as a restrictive act of control. However, it would seem that many women embrace their religious identity, even if that would appear that they were cowering into submission by patriarchy. This observation stymied Western feminists. How can feminism and feminist principles, which originated from the West, be compatible with religion and its seeming anti-women nature? Mahmoud draws from two cases to present her point. One is the women's mosque movement in Egypt, and the other, the women's piety movements in Indonesia. The counter-discourse offered by these movements led Mahmoud to suggest that, quote, we think of agency not as synonym for resistance into relation of domination, but as a capacity for action that historically specific relations of subordination enable and create, unquote. In the case of Tarbiyah Bukan PKS in Indonesia, many see the Tarbiyah movement as mirroring the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a radical Islamist movement in the Middle East. However, for Indonesian Muslim women, the radicalness is their love for Allah, and that veiling is a manifestation of religious freedom, both in the private and in the public sphere. In both cases, the women and girls who join these groups do not just study the Quran, but are also provided platforms to express their devotion to Islam while navigating the secular world. Mahmoud cites some issues that are discussed in these groups, such as if you are on public transportation and you are sexually harassed, how do you handle that as a devout person? And many more like that. So Mahmoud underscores that agency is to be found also in the inhabiting of norms, not only in resisting dominant discourses. The consequences is that religion is to be understood as a practice for opening up possibilities. Jürgen Habermas cautions liberal and secular political philosophers against dismissing the role of religion in the political spaces as archaic or almost extinct. In his article, Religion in the Public Sphere, Habermas describes an important quality in people whose religions inform their political lives. This important article contributes to the growing consciousness that the world is scripted in post-secular times because of the renewed interest in the centrality of religion in social and political lives of the people. Religion is back firmly in the public sphere. So faith in the 21st century takes into account not only the everyday lived religion or a particular way of life that is anchored in substantial belief in supernatural beings, but how that belief flows into convictions and resulting actions that extend into public spaces. Such faith pronouncements are often found in the mission statements of movements that are faith-based. Flowing from these theoretical insights, particularly in the delicate relationship of religion and the public sphere, the paper examines two important Catholic women's movements or organizations in Asia, namely Iglesia of Women in Asia and the Wanita Catholic Republic Indonesia, or WKRI. IWA is a transnational organization of Asian Catholic women theologians in Asia, while WKRI is based in Indonesia. The material in this paper is drawn from many sources. For IWA, I have drawn chiefly from its second volume, Body and Sexuality, which came out in 2007, as well as some statements from its official website, ecclesiaofwomen.com. For WKRI, I relied mostly on written accounts about the organizations which are published on the internet. I also utilized Google Translate to help me with the material, which is written only in Bahasa Indonesian. Now, it is important to unpack Asia. So geopolitical literature declares Asia as largely an imagined space, firmly gripped, bound, and sequestered by Western epistemological trajectories. By Asia, most people refer to that bunch of islands east to west. The fact that Asia encompasses 2/3 of the Earth's total landmass is mostly ignored, and all countries that lie within are thrown together in one indistinguishable heap. In masculinist, imperialist, ethnocentric case, the Orientals are the other insofar as they are east to west. In actuality, the inhabitants of Asia are varied and often inhabit lands, contexts, and realities very markedly different from one another. Religion-wise, Asia claims to be the birthplace of the world's major religions as well as numerous spiritual traditions. This fact alone is a testament to the cultural diversity of the region. It is important to unpack Asia insofar as it guides or directs the discussions in the paper. If we add gender and religion into the mix, the move becomes a necessary one in order to highlight the participation of women in the life of the church, the peculiarities of the members' lived experiences that shape their participation in social movements that are faith-based, and the impetus or catalyst that paved the way for the rise of these movements and the challenge of redefining faith in post-secular times. The Asia in Ecclesia of Women in Asia, a feminist forum of women doing theology from the academia and grassroots level in the region, is a deliberate attempt to frame the world in its own terms. It is meant to highlight both the particular way of looking at Asia from a Catholic feminist lens and the general way of regarding it, different countries in the region which come together for shared goals. In so doing, Iwa renders Asia as a metaphor for the real and imagined spaces that Asia includes and encompasses. A good use of metaphor produces a flash of insight when one is able to grasp the continuum between dissimilar events, objects, things, or situations. And it echoes what Sri Lankan theologian R.S. Sugartaraja deems as post-colonial work, which is essentially a style of inquiry, an insight or a perspective, a catalyst, a new way of life. The story of Iwa began when, in a conference organized by the Asian Federation of Catholic Bishops' Conference, the 4 women theologians, greatly outnumbered, were wondering, where are the women theologians? Are there more women doing theology in Asia that are called from women's experiences? These questions spurred a conference specifically targeted for women doing theology in Asia. This event is described in Iwa's website as a historic attempt at making Asian Catholic women seen and heard. 55 women theologians from all over Asia gathered in Bangkok, Thailand for a 5-day conference held on November 24 to 29 in 2002, entitled Ecclesia of Women in Asia, Gathering the Voices of the Silenced. So why would Iwa convene Asian feminist theologians to talk and write about in its second conference called Body and Sexuality? Filipino feminist theologian Agnes Brasal, who was then the Iwa coordinator for the 2004 conference and the editor of the book, explained in her opening remarks that the theme was recognition of the special course and role Iwa was pursuing in terms of doing theology that is contextual and rooted in the embodied experiences of women. The theme also highlighted how the seemingly innocent words like body and sexuality, when framed by religious discourse, could be demeaning or liberating to women. Moreover, she said that women's bodies are at the very center of power dynamics, which includes and excludes women at the same time. The inaugural 2002 Iwa conference was, by and large, a call for Asian Catholic women to come out of invisibility and into the spotlight. Thus, the call for papers and participation was broad. Most Catholic theologians in Asia operate under the liberative paradigm due to the prevailing influence of Latin American theologians who are doing theology of the poor. A prominent group, Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, or ITWOT, which has members from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, promotes liberation theology. It is not surprising that women theologians and pastoral workers are heavily geared towards social justice. However, most academic theologians, to distinguish them from grassroots workers, are exposed to feminism, especially Western feminism, and this exposure added another trajectory to their analysis. Gender then became an epistemological lens with which to do contextual theology. The deft use of feminism in the works of these women theologians suggests that they were oppressed in the current discourses in feminism. So far, IWA has produced 7 books already, and one of them is an e-book that you can download from Amazon.com. It's called The Liberating Power, Asian Feminist Theological Perspectives. In Body and Sexuality, we see the convergence of methodological frameworks, feminist, liberative, and post-colonial. The classic hermeneutic circle, experience, reflection, action, which is used in liberation theology, is expanded and deepened by feminism, as evident in the dynamics adopted by the 2004 IWA participants. The first step thus in contextual feminist theologizing, outlined by various workshops throughout the conference, was an identification of a contemporary Asian women's experience. In the process of identifying the experience, women were encouraged to ask why this experience is critical, and what were the religious and cultural beliefs that have reinforced dominant perspectives on that experience. Who suffered from these perspectives, how they suffered, and who profited from their suffering. Conversely, questions like, are there local cultural categories which can help provide a lens for looking at the experience differently, were asked. From identification and analysis, the process then moved on towards the identification of insights culled from these days together at the conference, which seemed relevant to analyzing the experience. Second step involved a rereading of scriptural and theological traditions. Similar to first step, local cultural categories were employed to help towards a rereading of scripture or tradition in relation to body and sexuality. Finally, third step involved a pastoral response or responses needed for action. Specifically, how would a newer and clearer theology on body and sexuality assist people's lives? So those are some of the questions that were asked. And what deeper theological examination or pastoral action or strategizing can each one personally undertake in relation to body and sexuality? These were some of the questions asked to elicit concrete actions that directly affect women's lives. Now, one of the most remarkable things that happened in the second book, Body and Sexuality, is the inclusion of this article called The Queering of Christianity. Now, Rosemary Radford Luther's now classic Sexism and God Talk comes to mind when we think of the many ways feminist theologizing interrogates, destabilizes, and dismantles traditional theology that has come to be taken as patriarchal and masculinist. Women have become locus theologicus, and that theology should speak of God in images that are culled from women's experience and or qualities. Her method, while drawing from women's experience in varied cultures and contexts, fails to adequately account for difference. For instance, there is no mention at all of the experience of lesbian and transgender women in the book, as well as recognition of other feminism apart from the traditional typologies of feminism, namely liberal, socialist, and radical. So therefore, the inclusion of the article, Queer Revision of Christianity, by Malaysian theologian Sharon Bong in Body and Sexuality had been noted in several reviews. Kwok Pulan regards it as challenging compulsory heterosexuality and motherhood. More importantly, it challenges the essentialist and heterosexist tendencies in Roman Catholic Church's supposed exaltation of modern women, specifically in John Paul II's letter to women in 1994, as well as engages some feminist theories who are still wary of the perceived ambivalence of the postmodern tradition to feminism. Queer revisions did not only tell the world that Asian women reject the absurd notion that women are always victims and therefore helpless, and that women can also be agents of their own desires and pleasures. And it also paved the way for Iwa to continue to interrogate itself in a self-reflexive way on being Asian women and doing theology that responds to the signs of the times. The Ecclesia of Women in Asia defines its conviction and sense of purpose in its vision mission statement. Iwa is committed to the formation of inclusive and just ecclesial communities and societies by doing theology from Asian women's perspectives and by the recognition of Asian Catholic women as equal partners in the life of the Church. Ecclesia of Women as a term is especially fraught in the dogmatically Catholic context. An image of Vatican on one hand, its sheer immense physicality announces the Catholic Church's masculinist and imperialist core, and an image of a community of Asian Catholic women interacting in cyberspace because it doesn't have a physical office or edifice or church, on the other hand, when juxtaposed together, cannot be starker. In its very liminality, the space that Iwa inhabits, which is neither geographical nor physical, becomes a site to announce publicly that the Church of the marginalized does not have to remain invisible. The visibility is also an affirmation that religion and faith does not have to be a private matter, and so the truth also rings through for resistance. The Wanita Catholic Republic Indonesia story. Now, theologian John Pryor marvels at the vibrant Christianities in the Java region, the birthplace of WKRI. According to him, you will need time to absorb the variety of Christianities in Java, the island where more than half of the population lives. Among the overwhelmingly Muslim majority, small Christian communities are visible in cities such as Surabaya, Malang, Yogyakarta, Semarang, Bandung, and the capital, Jakarta. These vibrant congregations consist not only of Japanese and Chinese Indonesians, but also of migrants from the outer islands. Many cultural and religious layers interlock, producing a great variety of churches. The story of WKRI began in 1924, when the founding members organized the first Women's Congress on December 22 to 25 of that year. Before WKRI, the organization was called Catholic Women of Indonesia. This historic gathering of Indonesian women, which took effect shortly after the establishment of the Republic, would be commemorated in the country as Mother's Day celebration, which falls annually on December 22. Due to this, WKRI is established firmly in the cultural and political life of Indonesia, even if it is an organization within the Catholic Church. Christianity is a minority religion in Indonesia. Just like many women's organizations in the country, be it Islamic or otherwise, WKRI is a combination of a number of cultural and religious frameworks. In many write-ups about the religion, the group is described as active in promoting the dignity of women. The movement's goal is to tackle male underdevelopment and gender issues. Initiatives include programs, female literacy, sewing classes, and other training courses. WKRI has over 86,000 members all over Indonesia. In the contemporary period, in her 2017 anniversary speech, WKRI President Justina Rostiawati emphasizes that the organization adheres strongly to the 5 principles of Pancasila, which is a set of philosophical precepts that guide the Republic. In the contemporary period, however, these principles are being threatened by radicalism and terrorism, according to her. And so WKR renews its commitment to the Republic by participating in the Indonesian President Jokowi's effort to revitalize the 5 principles of Pancasila. WKRI is often seen in Indonesia as a group of old-fashioned, elderly, and ignorant women. This is an unfortunate impression, however, and however it might have sprung from the organization's association with the conservative political elite in the country. Carl Steenberg describes the group as being more concerned with keeping the status quo than change, which I beg to disagree. In more recent documents, particularly in 2017, which is the year it turned 93 years old, WKRI reiterates that it holds social justice as part of its mission. Social justice is manifested in upholding diversity because, as the President puts it, the Republic of Indonesia consists of various tribes, races, and religions. It is very difficult to declare a race or race that one is genuine compared to the others. This state of affairs and the fact of their existence as Catholic women in Indonesia makes the work towards unity amidst diversity an important one, without exception. Indeed, the President reminds her community that the mission vision of WKRI inscribes the intimate connection between their religious identity and their national identity, the contour of which blurs into one another seamlessly. The container imagery in its logo points to the female womb. It is interesting to know that only mothers, either married or single, can become members of the organization. For the Japanese Catholic women theologian Nunuk Moriarty, an Asian feminist should be a feminist who has kind ecological orientation, since Asian culture is rich in matriarchal culture, which sees the womb as macrocosmos, which is a continuum of macrocosmos of the universe. The blue background of the WKRI logo symbolizes the Sacred Mother. In a blog entry written by a member on WKRI affiliated websites, the mother approach adopted by the organization resonates with the Japanese community because it speaks to the people. There is an abundance of terms associated with the mother, such as mom, mommy, mama, mbok, and many more. And delving deeper into the connotations of the Javanese terms, mamak and mbok would yield familiar images that bring forth pleasant memories of being enveloped by a mother's warm hug. However, younger generations of women seem to find no use for such images that conflate motherhood with domesticity. In fact, there is a growing movement to reject what they call the cultural constraints of kudrat, or destiny, which is essentially a life of domesticity. The WKRI has to adapt to the changing attitudes towards motherhood without compromising the core belief of the unique capacity of mothers to effect social transformation for the greater good of all people in Indonesia. In a blog entry written by another member, the defense of WKRI's maternal feminism rests on the group's reading of the role of Mary in shaping Jesus' life and actions. My understanding of this is that Jesus would not have become the Son of God had it not been for Mary's patient guidance and by her own action of accepting God's will. The modern Catholic Indonesian woman who is a member of WKRI channels Mary's example through her dedicated efforts of shaping her children's physical and mental health through becoming very involved in their education. The idea is that if mothers were heavily invested in the shaping of their children's values, they would grow right to become productive citizens of the country. WKR's vision, mission statements, and its civic involvements would seem to problematize the observation that because of its heavy maternal leaning, then it follows very strict gender roles. And so the mission vision statement problematizes that observation. Moreover, the social justice impetus that guides the organization's activities is concretized in resolving gender issues that impact on domestic lives. For example, a housewife retains the same voting rights as other family members. Now, redefining faith for the 21st century. So the WKRI's President's address during the 93 founding anniversary underscores the proper place of Catholic women, which is out there in public spaces and to be included in calls to action towards nation building. Although it is a government-recognized mass organization, it is not a political organization nor aligned with any political party. This is important to emphasize according to WKRI leaders so that the organization remains independent to pursue its aim. So WKRI's understanding of faith is rooted in love, which finds its found in a mother's love for her children, which enables her to guide them towards becoming citizens of the Republic who are able to foster unity in diversity, promote social justice, and defend human dignity. When Catholic mother bond and work together, the resulting movement is a strong moral force, which is embodied in a Catholic women's social organization that fight for humans, any religion, including non-Catholic people. The mission, as WKRI puts it, is extending the gospel message of divine love. Faith is not a private affair, it is very much a public one, and that is lived out in actions that benefit not just the immediate community, but also the entire nation. So let me move to my concluding remarks. My presentation of the two Catholic women's organizations highlights the point that the above observation that feminism is incompatible with religion. That observation falls right into the logic of essentialism, which feminists the world over dread. It plays right into the dichotomy of public, private, sacred, secular, primitive, modern kind of ideological constructs that prompt the continued presence of systemic violence in our midst. The study underscores that when we go deeper, dig deeper down to the roots, which is interestingly what being radical means, and listened with great reverence to the small stories of Catholics in the world, we can begin to see things differently. As Auga puts it, radical theology of life builds on little narratives or minorities. Having said that, I present two important realizations. First, we need to appreciate female-centered praxis. The contribution of the women of WKRI to the discussions on nation building calls for increasing the participation of women that affect them, such as greater economic opportunities without the threat of violence when they migrate abroad, access to universal health care, food security, and access to quality education. Second, we do not lose sight of the quest for justice. The quest for justice informs all our work, regardless of who is doing the work. Amidst the complexities of navigating the social structures that we inhabit, we can in fact be in solidarity with one another. The quest for justice is built on Jesus' words, "I have come to give you life and have it abundantly." WKRI uses the image of a twig which is attached to the main tree to describe the smallest part of their organization. Iwa literally has a quilt wherein small fabrics from all over Asia, courtesy of the participants of the first Iwa conference, are sewn. The quilt travels with Iwa as it goes about its conferences in different parts of Asia. These symbolic images highlight our solidarity with one another despite our differences, because we all want the same thing, and we hope the same for everyone in the world, the flourishing of everybody as God wishes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeane. Our second speaker is Emilce Cuda. And there's a lot in the biography that you can read. She holds actually two positions, research prof at Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, University of Buenos Aires, philosophy department, and is associate professor of philosophy at the Northern University of Arturo in Buenos Aires. She is active in a number of theological organizations, and so I'd rather just skip the rest of the biography and bring her up to begin her talk.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor, and thank you, Bill, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Karen, for all your work in this conference. And so happy to be here. It's not easy to be the speaker after 2 days with after 2 days of wonderful presentation. But we are lucky because we have a man in our panels. Well, as you know, I am from Argentina. I work in the theology of the people, that now you know, because our Pope is from there, and the people said that his theology is theology of the people. So my presentation will be so short because we have not too much time for that, but I would like to do a comparison, or maybe to put in relationship the people and the woman, to explain something about politics that maybe can help you to understand better Pope Francis. For us, for theology of the people, the reality is superior to the idea. You know, the Pope repeats this many times. And what it means, the idea is that for some persons, the ideas exist, and then from these ideas, they go to the reality to correct. For us, not for all the church in Argentina, but for some of us who work in theology of the people, the reality is the place where we go to see, to listen, and then to judge from the principles of the gospel, and then to act. But there is a big problem, because when we go to the reality, some persons has word, public word, but other persons has not the public word. So, when we listen, maybe, usually, we only can to listen the demands of the rich people, or maybe the demands that the people who is included in the society. So, if you take that demands at unity of politics analysis, maybe we come to be in a wrong, because it's not easy to listen the popular demands, because that people are not included in the public discourse. So, how we can resolve this? For us, people, el pueblo, somebody yesterday make a question about what it means, no? The pueblo. Well, it's easy to translate one word to other language, but it's not easy to translate one word to other culture. That is not easy. People, for example, in the United States, is a plural word. The people is like different individuals working together. The people, el pueblo, in Spanish, is one subject. When we speak about el pueblo, we think in a pueblo like one subject. And this is so different, and this changed all the view about the reality. If you did a sentence, you need to put, after you to put the people, you must to put all the pronouns in plural. The translate is not easy. Sometimes we need to use the people. But this is not a grammatic problem, but it's a problem in the language. For us, we think that, or maybe we can distinguish between the language of the world is the hegemonic discursive, the hegemonic discourse that you can listen in media, in the academy, in the literature, in the canonic books. But for us, there is another language that is outside the discourse. It's a symbolic language. You know, all language is symbolic, no? But the difference is that that part of the people who arrive to the place of power consider that their own symbolic language represents the absolute truth. So they consider the rest of the language as symbolic, but all the language is symbolic. The situation is that one part of the language is considered the truth. And from that reality, from that idea that they consider absolute idea, then they go to the reality to chat. So for us, it's important to distinguish two different languages. A discursive language, when you can go inside the culture, inside the discourse, because you are included, so your demands has the possibility to be articulate in a political discourse. But if you are outside the society, excluded of the goods, your word is not articulate in the discourse. So the popular demands are always outside the hegemonic discourse. So how we can listen that? In this case, I take like mediation the psychoanalysis. I take Jacques Lacan. Maybe you know him. Jacques Lacan is a French author, and he has 20 seminars, and I take the last two, 19 and 20 seminars, because there Lacan speak about the woman and about the one. And in that case, he said, one, like God, and woman, are outside the dominant discourse. Because the people, when they speak, don't listen words, don't listen arguments, they only listen noises. That's the reason why in Latin America, maybe in Asia or in Africa, when the people, the poor people, need to be listened, they don't use the word. They go and cut the street, cut the avenue, bump the, I don't know how is the, pombo, no? ¿Cómo sería?
Trams?
No?
Trams.
Yeah, trams. They must to do noises because nobody listen them. And when they speak, the people said, what he said? But he said, he must go to the school. He must go to the university. That is theology? No, no. You are not a theologian. You must go and study again at university. All the times, when you say something different, that they call symbolic language, they put you in falta, no? In the fault.
In fault?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you, if you can understand this, begin to give excuse. Oh no, I'm sorry, I need to study more, I don't understand. But the position of Lacan is that we have two different languages. One is the hegemonic discursive. The discursive, the discurso del amo is the name, is the dominant discourse. But other discourse is not possible to put in words. So, from where he take it? He take it from negative theology, from the negative way of the theology. And we can remember, for example, the Mr. Edgar, when he must go to listen, to understand, to try to understand the Beguinas in the Cuenca del Rin, in German. And maybe, I am sure you know what I am talking about. That was women who decide to take their own position, to live alone, and when the man or somebody who represents the discourse of the man was there, they said anything. They said nothing. And the man said, what they are talking about? Because they resist to be included in the discourse, in the hegemonic discourse. So, if we would like to understand what the poor part of the people are claiming, are demanding, we need to take this analysis from the psychoanalysis and to understand that they are in the position like a woman speaking in other mode. They speak with jest. They speak with noise. Now in March, 18 March, I am sure all of us can watch on TV women around the world in different cities and different countries, thousands of them, thousands of us. But which was exactly the demand who articulate that meeting? Nothing. We call that empty signifier. What is the empty signifier? It's one demand, anyone that in one moment can to do the articulation between all the demands. But that is only for a moment. It's like ecstasy. It's like a mystics. It's only one moment. And why this is so dangerous for the power? Because this demand, as an empty signifier, come to cross all the society, all the countries, all the social class, genders, religions. How you come to capture this? What they are talking about is nothing. The idea is not that the women are going to take the power, take the government, and drive the world. That is not the idea. The idea, in the sense of Lacan, Jacques Lacan said, is this mode of language has the capacity to articulate different, inconnex, popular demands. And that is real the problem in politics. Because women, like popular part of the people, can to say something in another language outside the hegemonic discursive, and if you are so much inside the hegemonic discursive, you can't understand what the women are talking about and what the people, the poor people, are talking about. To understand that, from the theology of the people, we said, you must to be inside the popular culture. You must be between them. Only you must to be there. The idea is not not to build definitions about what is the people, or what is the woman, or what is the other, or the absolutely other. The idea is only to be there. We change. Yo estoy por nosotros estamos. We change. I am, or I am, for I am here. It's different. It's not something that we can say. It's something that only we can take a position, stay there, be part of them to understand. There is an interesting movie about the woman, no? It's I don't remember the name now, but it's a movie maybe 15 years ago. It's a publisher man who tried to understand women, and one day he began to listen what they said, no? But for to do that, he must begin for a moment a woman. He must to put in the place of a woman. He dressed high heels and this is funny, but this is the idea to understand the people from Argentina. To understand the people is not possible only reading books. I can stay there speaking with you for 2 hours, for 2 years, but I never can transmit you what is the people in Latin America and what is the people in Argentina. And in the same sense, I can't explain you what is the people in the United States. Maybe I can read a lot of books, but to understand that, I need to be part of them and begin to listen what they are talking about. Because the problem is not the language. The problem is the culture, how to understand that. In theology of the people, to explain this, we make a difference between science and sapiential knowledge. Science and sapiential knowledge. Why? Because for us, the poor part of the people has their own knowledge. And that knowledge for us is sapiential knowledge. It's not science knowledge. In that case, for us, wisdom is with the people, because they know something, they know how is the truth, but when they try to explain this, try to say this, they speak in another mode. So we never said that a theologian or a political man go to the people to teach, to adoctrinate the people, because we consider that they have their own wisdom, so they can organize themselves. We only, when we do theology, we stay with them. If they go to the square, we go with them. Maybe sometimes we can understand, and most of the time we can't understand, because really we are not part of the people. If we are here, and if we went to the university, and we have a PhD, and we travel around the world, now we are so far from the people. Sometimes we can understand, but the idea is to be with them, to be part of them. Acompañar, we say, acompañar. And in this case, the political movement is so interesting in Latin America, and in my opinion, in grand part of the world, because if we think how was the politics in the 19th and 20th century, the politics was through the war, through the discourse. That was a political party. What is a political party? A political party is a representation of different parts of the society. And that is the secularization, because to the Industrial Revolution, if you think what was politics was only an opposition discursive between two parts of the bourgeoisie. But the poor people has not part in political discussion. And that opposition was a mask about religion. Well, Bill knows a lot about this, about religion. Religion was an excuse to hide what was really the problem. And that was not secular, because the people think that they was fighting about truth. But with the Industrial Revolution, this changed. And we have two positions. The rich position in a party who represents their own interest, and the poor people in another party who represents their necessities. In this case, the political discourse changed. And it's not about the truth, but about social rights. That was in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, the discussion about the truth is coming again in the field of the politics. So, in my opinion, we are in a post-secular political situation. And if we can understand what happened in the reality now, it's not enough to take the political and theological categories from the 20th century, because we have not more political parties, we have movements. We have not more ideas, and the people go to put a vote from an idea, from a party, from a discursive, absolutely articulate. The people today put a vote to one person, and in 2 months to other person. And the actual presidents in Latin America, in the United States, and in other countries are not exactly from political parties. They come outside of the parties. They come outside of the discourse. And this is the point where I want to arrive. We are in a moment post-secular because the discussion is about the truth again. The people forget, go to the street to fight about social rights. The poor people in Latin America, for example, is in the street fighting about interests that are not their interests. They want to know the truth. How many money take this prison? How many money take that company? they want to know the truth. But at the same moment, they are losing all the social rights that they get for 200 years. So the truth is, again, a political problem. And if we are theologians, we need to fight in that terms, because truth is a problem of the theology. That was not a problem of the theology for 200 years when the science take the place of the theology. Before science, the person who judged what was the truth was the theologian. But after modernity, the place of the theologian was taken for scientifics. And scientifics say what is true or not. But now we are in a post-secular position because, for example, in the case of some presidents in Latin America, the justice can't to prove how much corrupt they are. But the people is not looking the proofs. The people believe the discourse. They want to meet the truth. And they are after other truth that our true Jesus Christ. No? So I think for understand this situation, the political situation, theologian, in this moment, we have a big opportunity for actor, but in my opinion, we must to see how is the language of the women in this sense. No? It's I am not the correct word, but it's in the sense, not the body of woman, but in the fame sense. No? It's another mode to speak. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Emilce. I'd like to welcome Jeane, who's going to talk to us on solidarity in the streets, Catholic women's leadership in northern Uganda. She's an associate professor of theology and director of the African Studies program at Creighton University, that's in Nebraska, Omaha. And his research focuses on modern Catholic history and theology in East Africa, particularly the Great Lakes region. His first book is Rwanda Before the Genocide, Catholic Politics and Ethnic Discourse. And he's done many other things, so we'd like to invite him to come up now.
Thank you. While I'm calling this up, I'm going to follow the pattern that was established in the last days of after the second talk we stand, we stretch, and maybe introduce yourself to the person next to you. I'd like to, again, express a word of gratitude to Bill Kavanaugh, Karen Francis, and others for their great organizations. This is my second time here, and it's just a wonderful gathering. I have to admit, about a month or two ago, I read through the list of presenters. I read through, and it was very impressive. And I looked again, I thought, wait a second, where are the other men? And I looked through again, I was like, no. I'm the only man. And so I was quite intimidated by this for obvious reasons, but I have to thank two people for encouraging me. My colleague in theology, some of you may know, Sue Califf, New Testament scholar, who when I expressed this to her said, Jay, do you think women are the only ones who should care about women's movements? No! We need more men to do this! And she's a former basketball coach who, like Sister Rosemary, she'll box you. And then the second is my 4-year-old daughter, Adelaide, who, when I told her that I was the only boy presenting, she thought this was great. She's like, there are no other boys and all girls? I was like, yes. Well, God, I want to come with you. This is wonderful. So on those notes, again, but again, I'm grateful to be here, and really I've learned so much. And in any case, let's move forward. So I'll start off. My two co-presenters, again, I think on a theoretical level, are very sophisticated. I don't think I'm going to offer that same level of sophistication. In some ways, I'm actually actively avoiding systematics, or what in maybe a negative sense, essentialism, by focusing on the particular. And part of that's because of who I am, where I stand, the context I come from. And also I'm trained in some degree, very much like a historian. I also should note as a caveat, I'm not working primarily on a book exclusively on Catholic women's leaders. The people I'll talk about today are part of a broader book on Catholic public leadership in post-colonial Uganda. So that's a book I'm hoping to make a lot of progress on when my family and I are living in Uganda next year. So the ecclesial model that I'm going to outline here is called solidarity on the streets. So let me try to break that down. Before we get into the people, what am I talking about? Now this is an educated audience, theologically. So I know some of you are already thinking, like, where's he going to go? Is he going to go Vatican II? Is he going to, Most of my freshmen have no idea what solidarity is. So usually I like to use this definition from John Paul II. So solidarity is not a vague feeling, a vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. And again, so just keep that in mind. At least there are other ways to define this, but that's what I have in mind when I use the word solidarity. The second is the streets. Now you can search high and low in magisterial discourse for the streets, particularly before Pope Francis, and you're not going to find a lot. So I decided to go to the Urban Dictionary. And it was amazing to me. This is an online source. You're welcome to check it out. But the number of definitions for street or the streets, and many of which actually have a lot of resonance with the people I'm looking at. One is maybe what we might think of, where the poor urban ghetto people live. So often associated with poverty, often associated with an urban context. Even the term ghetto, at least in the American context, has all sorts of connotations. But listen to these other ones. Being able to pick up on all things quickly. So to be street is to be able to learn, to be creative, to not just be book smart, but street smart, and to be able to learn, again, as our previous presenter said, to learn from the reality before us. Relating to all types of people, so the ability, again, not to just be comfortable with one group, but to interact even with many different than yourselves. The opposite of bourgeois, street implies hustle, one of my favorites. Now, friends, we're very bourgeois right now, to be honest. I remember our colleague of mine, I was kind of lamenting the fact how I don't want to be bourgeois. She's like, Jay, you're a professor at a middle-class university. You can't help but be bourgeois, so just be bourgeois and admit it. But I think there's something here, and I'll talk more about this, as several of the individuals we're looking at, to some degree, could be bourgeois, but have moved, and I'll come back to that. And there's a sense, particularly in the movement, that there's an energy, there's a creativity, and it also requires a lot of entrepreneurial energy. Number 5, the cold reality of day-to-day life and achieving. And I think this also helps us to not be overly romantic about this kind of idea. The fact that being on the streets is tough, but it's also ordinary. And it also entails a whole lot of just ordinary achievement of all sorts of people. So again, those are all in the background when I say solidarity on the streets. Now, theologically, I'd also like to break this concept down in 3 ways. And so when I say solidarity on the streets, I first talk about relocation to the streets. And here I draw particularly on the thought of the African-American Christian activist John Perkins, still with us down in Mississippi, a real forerunner, particularly of post-civil rights work in Mississippi and the broader South. And Perkins defines relocation and theologically in terms of incarnation. So he talks about how God, in becoming Jesus Christ, in some way leaves a place, comes into our world, takes up the form of a slave, the ordinary life, and also encounters people. And so, as he says here, living involvement turns poor people from statistics into our friends. It's not just an idea, but now these are the people around us. And I also draw here for relocation on the thought of Pope Francis. And again, in this statement I'm sure many of you are familiar with from Evangelii Gaudium, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. And of course the Pope, as in gestures like this, has embodied this as much as he's spoken it. And in a famous scene from the youth prison in Rome where the Pope washed the feet of some of those in detention. So beyond relocation, the second principle is the idea of speaking from the streets. And here I teach at a Jesuit university, so I'm going to use a little bit of Jesuit speak here. But we often talk to our students about being men and women for and with others. In this case, it's maybe a little more for. Sometimes we use language I don't really like, called the voice for the voiceless. It feels kind of patronizing to me, a bit paternalistic. As I'll say later, one of the women I'll talk about today talks about amplifying the voice. The voice is already there, but it needs to be louder, it needs to stretch out, it needs to be heard. And I think that's an important principle in terms of speaking from the streets. How do you amplify the voice? Again, so that those in, say, the hegemonic power actually hear it. Second, raising awareness and drawing in external resources. So part of, again, as we'll look at today, these figures are very good at drawing in both national attention, often in an under-resourced part of the country, and also drawing in international attention, and often that comes with very, very much needed resources. And then third is transforming the streets. And here, I'm going to use my hometown here of Omaha, a group called Abide Ministries. It's been one of the most successful sort of violence prevention efforts in North Omaha. And the way they started about 25 years ago, and actually an interracial family, moved from the suburbs into the city, but really began working with people. And interestingly, they defined themselves as an inner city nonprofit organization with a dream that one day Omaha, Nebraska would have no inner city. I love NGOs that want to put themselves out of business. Like one day, we're not needed anymore, right? Maybe the church could even learn a little bit sometimes from this. We're not necessarily the ultimate essential. But the way they do this is not so much through rescuing, but rather through empowering. And it's very local. So they go street by street. They have what are called kind of lighthouse systems. So they work with local neighbors on the block. They start off with like sort of cleanup projects. They have block parties. They don't even start, they're a Christian group, but the first thing isn't even to go to church. It's just to create community, to turn the street around, working through people who are actually living there. And so the idea, again, not to rescue or to save, but rather to empower people to take agency. Again, so that you can slowly see signs of the reign of God breaking out. So that's all in the background, again, of the three people I'm looking at. And we can talk a little bit about how are they embodying these principles. All right, so Catholic women's leadership, 3 exemplars of solidarity on the streets. The first person I'll talk about is Sister Rose Mystica Muyenza. Born in 1938, Sister Rose was a Uganda native, so she's from Uganda province, near the city of Mukono. She actually was from a relatively wealthy Anglican property-owning family in southern Uganda, so she herself came from at least relative privilege, and that's actually a little bit of a theme we'll see today. She chose to become Catholic at a young age, and I'm still investigating all the reasons for that. But I think one of the reasons, even though the Catholic Church was not the most powerful church in Uganda, one of the reasons is something that came up a little bit yesterday, which is that to become a religious sister offered independence. It offered a chance for her to be her own person and to not be, in some ways, enslaved in a domestic situation. So she joined one of the largest women's religious communities in East Africa, the Little Sisters of St. Francis, founded by the Irish missionary Mother Kevin in the 1920s, and now with communities in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. But Sister Rose is a restless person. And the Little Sisters at this time were known as educators. They also worked some in healthcare. But she really wanted to do social work. And the community allowed her actually to go to Makerere University, Uganda's most prominent university in the early 1960s, where she became one of the first religious sisters to ever study social work. But she loved it so much that she didn't want to go back. And so she leaves the Little Sisters in 1967 really because she didn't want to live in the cloisters. She didn't want to be removed, but she wanted to be on the streets of the city. And at this point, the community was still a little resistant to going fully in that direction. Interestingly, she continued to call herself Sister Rose, or Aunt Rose, everybody you talk to in Kampala, that's always the name. She continued to wear her brown habit, really to live out the life of a sister. And in fact, she started a semi-religious community called the Daughters of Charity. And these are not the Daughters of Charity, you might be familiar with, but it was their own kind of community, really of young women, as was defined in their first mission, helping young girls with social problems. And these problems could include fleeing poverty, it could include getting out of sex trafficking. As the war advanced in the 80s, increasingly people were war refugees, those with HIV/AIDS. But she had a kind of semi-religious vision for this. And so there was prayer, there was some degree of formation, education. For example, some of the women I interviewed who were Daughters of Charity would talk about her, going to the 7 a.m. Mass at Christ the King Parish in downtown Kampala, and waking them up by throwing water on their face, and then putting them in the truck, and then they'd all sing "We Are the Daughters of Charity" as they would drive down into Christ the King Parish in Kampala. So there was a kind of semi-religious focus here, but also a strong focus on vocational training. And as Sister Rosemary talked the other night about sewing as not the end, but as an entree, in this case it was catering. So catering and baking were the entree vocationally. And then many of these young women were then given opportunities for secondary and higher education, and ultimately many were encouraged to start their own business. So, for example, one of the largest caterers in Uganda, in Kampala today, is actually a former daughter of charity, works downtown. So speaking from the streets, Sister Teresa Basamera, herself a formidable sister, definitely a boxer, Sister Rosemary. Talked about, she worked very closely with Sister Rose, and she talked about how she could knock anywhere and they would open. Just a wonderful networker. And she herself, to earn money, worked at the Bank of Uganda. She later worked in the civil service. And so in some ways she was earning, you might say, like a regular civilian job while doing all this work as a second sort of vocation. She developed important political partnerships, including with Jeane Museveni, the First Lady of Uganda since the mid-80s. Maureen Reagan, the daughter of the president, adopted and supported several daughters of charity in the late 1980s. She also had church-based partners in the UK as well as Italy, which helped her to construct various homes like Kawanga Charity Home in Mukono, which is primarily focused on special needs children, Sabina Home in Rakai near Masaka, which is founded at the heart of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the late 1980s, and then St. Michael Home in Kampala to work with street children. And then she also built nonprofit partnerships, including with LUESO, the Uganda Women's Efforts to Save Orphans, the Children of Uganda, and Uganda Children's Charity Foundation. So in many ways, she's a successful networker, again, both within the city, nationally, internationally as well, and drawing in resources. Her women were known for their choir, Christ the King, and she would take the choir, for example, on trips in the US for fundraising tours. And over the course of around 20 to 25 years, she worked with over 3,000 youth. And this is in a long-term way. I mean, not just people passing in and out, but in formation, putting them through school, living in the communities. So a very impressive effort. This is actually a picture I took last year when I was doing research on this, but one of the common biblical visions for Sister Rose's community was from Mark 10:14, the idea of let the children come on to me. You see that all over her various facilities. So as one described me, the woman with a golden heart, in terms of her personality, again, known for a life of self-denial and deprivation, slept on a 2-by-3-foot mattress, would share that with any sort of refugee child who needed it, slept several hours a night. Some of the former daughters of charity actually were kind of critical of this. I mean, they said, Sister Rose sacrificed so much that ultimately she got Alzheimer's in her early 60s. She burnt herself out. But it was also very, very impressive, and the authenticity of her witness was real. I already mentioned a life of prayer and Mass. She was also known for her Eucharistic adoration, which she spent a significant part of Thursdays in that. And then an independent life. As one social worker who worked closely with Sister Rose said, you know, she got on well with the Archbishop. You know, he supported her. She got on well with the little sisters. She didn't break relations, but she wanted to be the boss of her own. She wasn't under the bishop. She wasn't under the community. She did her own thing. And in some ways, this was a real gift. But even some of her close associates said she also could tend to be a micromanager. And so she tended to control everything so tightly that also when she died, and this is still ongoing, there's sort of a period of crisis in terms of what to do with the institution. So Sister Rose's legacies of solidarity on the streets. One is this idea of embodying authentic witness, or the opposite of bourgeois, you could say. And I think, again, as someone who works primarily with undergraduate students, a lot of things, frankly, in the Christian tradition don't resonate with young adults. One thing that does resonate is authenticity, and particularly a witness to justice, and someone who's really living things out on the streets. I think Sister Rose has that in spades. Second, the entrepreneurial creativity. And so her ability, again, to draw on different resources, to move from business into the church, to work these kinds of networks, I think is also an important lesson for us. And then third, this is a very important phrase that several of our associates used in Uganda, Okuyamba Abanaku, or the people without people. And because the language I was using was the idea of the poor, and I was thinking like the material destitute. And people said, no, Sister Rose worked with the people without people. The people that don't have relational networks, that don't have family, in a culture like we learned yesterday where the church is family, right? So if you are a former Catholic sister who's been thrown out of your community, where do you go? If you're the illegitimate child of a priest, where do you go? And so all of these, so there was a very, very strong message from many of her associates. She worked with the people without people. And I think it's important in whatever context we're in to think, who are those people, even if, and in terms of how we define the question of poverty. So let's move now to Ms. Rosalba Oiwa, who I think Sister Rosemary knows. So the question and answer, we can learn more. So, Rosalba Oiwa was born in 1953. She's an Acholi native of Gulu district in northern Uganda. Like Sister Rose, very, very educated person, went to study chemistry and biology at Makerere in the 1970s, which is so very rare for women to be studying the natural sciences at that period. She went on to work as a science teacher. She had 5 children in the 1970s and early 1980s. And then her husband very tragically died in 1986 during the initial, what was known as the Holy Spirit Movement uprising, led by the prophetess Alice Lakwena. And this is the precursor to the better-known Lord's Resistance Army movement that Joseph Kony led. Kony was actually related to Lakwena. So she moves back to Gulu in 1989. She herself was an internally displaced person for several years, but things settled down enough that she could move back to her home. And as soon as she moves back, she begins, as I say here, speaking for peace from the streets of Gulu. In 1989, she organized a famous Gulu women's protest. If you've ever seen the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about the Charles Taylor regime in Liberia, women in Liberia did similar things, which is massive public protest on the streets, but also stripping off their clothes to scandalize the police, the soldiers, and across the kind of cultural taboos that were there. And in fact, for Rosalba, this resulted in at least a temporary peace that lasted for several months in 1989. She went on to organize annual marches for peace in Gulu town from 1992 that continued throughout the time of the war in the north. In 2000, she helped convince Belgian donors to provide funding to help revive the Mataput process, which has been one of the more important restorative justice processes, particularly within Acholi culture in northern Uganda. In 2005, she worked with the Archdiocese of Gulu to initiate a regional Peace Week tradition that started in the region of Acholi land and expanded into Longo, Kitgum, and then ultimately even into South Sudan as well. But what Rosalba is particularly known for, again, is this idea of speaking from the streets and amplifying the local voice. And so throughout these years, her primary job was to work as a local analyst. And she worked with the British-based Agency of Cooperation for Research and Development, better known as ACCORD, based in the UK but with branches all over. And she also worked, I should add, on the Refugee Law Project based in Kampala, and primarily on issues of reparations, restorative justice, and also documenting the abuses that were going on. And the LRA abuses are well known. What's sometimes not as well known is how abusive the National Resistance Movement government of Museveni was in the north, and even the kind of atrocious camp conditions that people were living in. So that, as Rosalba says, in the year 2000, upwards of 1,000 were dying a week in these internally displaced camps. And this is part of the reason that for all of his brutality, Kony was able to draw some support, because of how brutal the government was treating people. Even today, Rosalba continues to speak out against government land grabbing and corruption. Often in 2017 and 18, these are parastatal groups that are run by close politicians of the government that just buy up land and either don't compensate people or compensate them at very low levels. And of course the questions of corruption, which any observer of Uganda sees all over the place. So again, I was very struck in my time with her by the passion by which she continues to engage, even talking about the conditions in refugee camps as well. So what do we learn from Rosalba Oiwa? One, again, to borrow some Jesuit language, moving from charity to justice. She told me, again, part of the problem she has with government attitudes is that they see questions of land reform and victim compensation as gifts. So these are not gifts, these are rights. Right? People's land has been taken from them, they've lost their loved ones. This is a question of justice. Second is the importance of social analysis. I don't know that we always think about that in terms of grassroots leadership, but it's incredibly important that the analysis is there, and two, that it's informed. And as the head of the Justice of Peace Commission in Gulu said to me, nobody knows things better than Rosalba in terms of what's going on here. And as Rosalba herself said, we have to get to the root causes. How can we stop the cycle of suffering or handouts? And then third, empowering and giving voice to local women. And so she talked to me at length about the networks of women that she works with. And interestingly, she talked in more generic terms, but here she started to use even gendered language and talked about how men often want to take credit for something and they don't want to share. She talked, for example, about how the peace negotiator, Betty Bagombe, had nearly achieved peace in the North, but men didn't want to allow her to have credit for it. And she said, women here, we mobilize other people, we work with other people, that allows us to achieve more. All right, so Sherry Meyer. The first thing you might notice about Sherry Meyer is that she is not Ugandan. Despite the clothes. Sherry Meyer, anyone know Sherry Meyer here? A couple people. All right, Sherry Meyer is from Indiana. So she actually was born outside Indianapolis. She was educated by the Franciscans all the way through college. She joked with me that she thought all priests were Franciscans until she was a young adult. There are probably better, worse ways to think of priests than as Franciscan. She went on to serve as a Catholic school English teacher and a principal in Indiana. And then in her mid-30s, she began to experience a call to ministry. She actually studied here at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And there her story might end. Except a little bit, those of you familiar with mission history in Africa, a little bit like Charles Lovigere or Daniel Comboni, she starts to dream of Africa. Right? Literally. So I'm interviewing her and she's like, I know this sounds crazy, but I'm having dreams about Africa. And I never wanted to go to Africa. I didn't go into ministry to go to Africa, but I'm having dreams about Africa all the time. And she's like, I'm a white 40-year-old American. Why am I dreaming about it? So she goes through discernment, she goes through retreats, and the call remains. And so she joins a group called the Volunteer Missionary Movement, works primarily with lay missionaries, and in 1991 moves to West Nile, which is in the far northwest corner of Uganda. She had talked to me at length about being very independent. She was the oldest of 6 children. She was a principal, a teacher, a single woman. She prided herself on her independence. And she said, and what do I have to do for months in Uganda is learn to be dependent. And as she said, and I'll just quote her, how do you take a bath here with basin and soap? How do you hold a chicken? How do you prevent the chicken from shitting on you? And so these kind of questions circulating through and realizing like, Sherry, you can't run stuff here. You've got to learn, you've got to listen, or you're going to die. But she also had to realize that she had a contribution to make, because she said she struggled for a while, like, why am I here? Like, maybe I need to just go home. But ultimately, local Comboni priest encouraged her to, she had been trained in lay ministry. And there was a real need for the training and empowerment of lay ministers in the Arua town and elsewhere. So she started lay ministry workshops, she worked to translate Lumco materials for the famous South African Institute. And she told me at some length that she stayed in part because there was very little witness of an engaged lay woman. Not a religious sister, not a male lay catechist, not a priest, but a lay woman at the altar, helping to set things up, training people. She said she felt a real call in a way to witness in a different way. Her ministry changed a little bit in the 2000s, and when the Combonis decided to start a new radio station called Radio Pacis, or Peace of Christ for All. And Sherry, along with Father Tonino Pasolini, were the two initiators of this. And Sherry described this as what she called gospel values radio. So it includes things like catechesis and mass, and Sherry's very proud of her daily scriptural reflection. In fact, I don't see Barbara Reed here, but even in Uganda, she talked about how important Barbara was to her formation, how much she appreciated that. But also there are programs on human rights, questions of health, education, sports, gender and family, and civic education. So the idea is that you represent the whole gospel, not just do religious radio, or not just do like hip-hop politician-controlled community radio, which is often the way things work with propaganda for the government. They've developed an audience of over 10 million listeners, so it's actually the largest in the region, going across 3 different countries. And they also won the 2007 BBC Best New Radio Station in Africa Award. And this was quite unexpected, and when they actually got back to the airport in Arua, like thousands of people were at the airport, and then I get a little choked up, but they actually accompanied them all the way back to the radio station at Arua. So in terms of transforming the streets, I would need to spend a lot more time on the ground to get this, but 2 things I got in my initial work there, and just so you know, you can see here just the range. South Sudan, all the way to Congo, across northern Uganda. There's 6 different languages, 3 radio frequencies. But two things that came up in my time last summer is the idea of creating sacred space for a new conversation. And I think at its best, that's what liturgy does. It creates a sacred ritual space where we can hear something, hear the truth of God. Likewise, the radio can do that. And as one man said to Sherry in the grocery store, the things you see on the radio are really unique. No one else can say that to us. And he was specifically talking about gender education and the treatment of women in the home. And the fact that there were real taboos over talking about that. But by listening to the radio and hearing the program, it opened up a new conversation. And then second, the empowering of local staff. I was really impressed in my interviews with people working at Radio Pacis by this general sense of that they own the radio station, that we're all part of it. That Radio Pacis has not just inspired people, but helped us to grow. And that Sherry and Tonino can leave and go on holiday and go away, and we're fine, because it's our radio station. So, Meyer's legacies of Catholic leadership. First, and I think it's important to state this, she described her legacy as one of administration, competence, organization, and planning. She said, I don't know that people, I don't think I'm beloved, but I get things done. And again, there's been a lot of talk even this weekend about institutionalism and the institutional church, and yes, that can be oppressive. But institutions matter, and as she said, all the charisma in the world can just die if you don't have institutions to carry it forward. Second, this is my own terminology, but she embodied to me what I would call a post-colonial John the Baptist missiology. So from the Gospel of John, the idea that he, or in this case the people, must increase, I must decrease. So to be a missionary in a post-colonial world is not easy, given the legacies, which are very deserved of very oppressive missionaries. But Sherry's model is very much empowering, and even a few years ago, she basically retired from the radio station to allow other people to lead, and just serves now as a consultant. And then finally, long-term commitment. And in Sherry's words, the difference between missionaries and development workers is that missionaries come to stay and live. So they're there for the long haul. Solidarity, again, is not just a feeling, but it's something lived and embodied over the long term. So I'll close again with the words of a local Comboni priest named Romanus Dada, who, when asked about Father Tonino and Sherry, said, "We're proud of them. I appreciate them so much. They have given their lives to this place. We hope they die here." And I thought, maybe that's the ultimate statement of solidarity, that you've given your life and we hope that you're buried here and that you're in our soil now. So that's a fitting note to close, so thank you.
We have a nice period for questions and answers, both from the audience to our speakers and among the speakers. So I'd like to first invite anyone in the audience to come up to the microphone.
Well, this time is very much in the front. Right. In the center there. I actually have three questions, one for each of you. For Jeane, as you were moving towards the conclusions, you said in your first conclusion that we need to appreciate female-centered praxis. And I wonder if you could tell us just one thing that we could do, maybe in the Northern Hemisphere, something that we could do to learn to appreciate more that praxis, if that is possible. And for Emilce, you left us with a nice final thought about the post-secular world and the need to now listen, right, to that search for truth that is not the scientific truth. And you mentioned woman, that we need to learn how to listen to woman. And I wonder if you can use this time to kind of just tell us more, because I was wanting to know more. And for James, well, thank you all for your presentations. And I mean, I appreciate the information that you bring in this post-colonial historical period in Uganda. It would have been nice to actually see Sister Rose and Miss Rosalba here speaking about their own, ministries. But moving it more now to decolonial theories, if that is possible. So, how? I want to understand how you as a man will view this dynamics of having one woman doing this kind of work, this kind of ministry in the streets than other men. So if you can help us there to see, understand better that gender dynamics. I don't know if the question makes sense, but.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. With regard to female-centered practice, I'm really, developing a conversation between and among women, and sometimes, as I've also mentioned in the background prior to that, prior to the concluding remarks, that especially in some parts of Asia, and I mentioned in the paper, Japanese scholars who really do not want to have anything to do with religion at all, because religion is seen as very oppressive, and if there are, when we talk about female-centered practice, it rings, it seems to allude to essentialism, or it seems to romanticize, mothering, or something gynecologically, centered. But when we really look into what is going on in the ground or on the streets, we realize that in many Catholic women and in many Catholic women's movements, they do not have problem with accepting the role of being a mother, or having, they don't see a problem with the values such as caring, and being nurturing. They don't see that as something that ties them to their biology. It's just that they accept that. So, for many women in North America or in the Western world, and also mentioned about many feminists who are allergic to any allusion to essentializing gendered role. That would seem like those qualities are not really exclusive to women, and certainly men do care, men do nurture, but also appreciating that in many parts of the world, those values are not seen as antithetical, to their liberation, things like that. So that's exactly what I meant by female-centered praxis. It's really owning those qualities that are traditionally, understood to be female or feminine. But as Agnes has pointed out in her presentation yesterday, those values do not seem to be really exclusive to women only. That when you are caring or nurturing, or even when you give birth or things like that, you also show very traditionally understood as masculine qualities. So these are not really exclusively or mutually exclusive terms. And we can see that these are in fact integrated in the lives of Asian Catholic women and the way that they live out their faith.
Well, thank you very much for your question. Miriam, where are you? Okay. Well, it's a good question. First, I think we must do three distinctions. Secular and secularisms are different things. Christians and Catholics are so, ¿cómo se dice? Asustados? So
Frightened.
Yeah, about secular, no? But secular is good. Secularism is bad. And we need to distinguish two. I'm going to say one. We must distinguish between true gods and false gods. And we must understand that when God is in the place of the man politics, we are in trouble. Not the true gods. Political theology learns us that there are a lot of gods. One, for us, is the true God. But there are a lot of crazy persons who take the place of the God. And you have a dictator in the government. When the God is speaking, the man can't speak. If somebody who thinks that his God is sitting at the throne, we are in trouble. That was the word for the patristics. The patristics need to put the God outside the war, and that was a big problem, because the empire was taking the place of the God. You know, when God is in the politics, the people is in silence. The secular period was good because the people can take the public word, and for 200 years was the first time in the history that poor workers people come to be seated at the parliament. Why? Because God, or maybe false God, was putting outside the politics. In that moment, the people has a public word because their demands are articulated in the public discourse. But now, in my opinion, I'm taking other authors like Giacomo Marramao from Italy, for example. In my opinion, in the 21st century, the public word disappeared, and only some person who take the discursive and they think that they are God said what is the truth and what not. Outside the pruebas, outside the proofs, it's not necessary proof to show what that I am saying to you is the truth. Where is that? I don't know. It's my truth. The new scientific, the new theologian now are the mass media. Mass media tell us what is exactly the truth. It's not more necessary theologian, but neither scientific persons. So, this is, in my opinion, a post-secularist period, because some part of the humanity, a few part of them, are taking the place of God, and their discourse is only the truth, and the rest of the persons are putting aside. I think workers, poor people, are going to be outside of this public discourse in a rational logic. And why? What is the relationship with the women? Because this year, in March, for the first time in the history, and if somebody here know another example, please tell me, was the first time that at the same moment, one demand was articulated around the world. Never the workers can get that. Only the women can get that. But in silence, they have not a special political programs. They have not the same political demands. The demands in Iran was not the same demands in Argentina. In my country, for example, the demand, part of the demand was the abortion. But that was not the reality in Spain, for example. So, I think the women are taking the public place in silence, outside of the political discourse, outside of the doctrine discourse, and only taking the place. And that is another language, that is another mode to speak, and that is probably too in the 21st century. But this is the first time that one demands can be articulated around the world. Never the union workers, for example, can get that at the same moment, same day, same moment. No? That is the reason why I'm doing the relationship between the poor people and the discourse of the women that is outside the discourse.
I'll just quickly, particularly recommend the work of Patricia Daly in Burundi on the way in which both the colonial and the post-colonial state have been marked by a kind of masculine hegemony and just a spirit of kind of dominance, control, violence, and fear, and how the sort of gendered framework is being mirrored at the state level. So just in terms of the theory, I think that's a particularly strong work. And also I think it's mirrored in actual reality. So that might be one reason why you see maybe a gender imbalance. One thing I think is interesting though is, and maybe this was echoed by Jeane as well, but is the kind of pushing of categories. So for example, several of the former Daughters of Charity described Aunt Rose as, she was almost like a man. I was like, what do you mean by that? She was independent, strong, she didn't take orders. And then likewise, so sort of pushing, but people grappling kind of with what that means. And then likewise, someone like Father Tonino, a Camboni priest, who really, again, I focus more on Sherry Meyer, but they really collaborate. And again, here's a guy who actively reflected on the need to think of his priesthood in different terms, not in terms of control and dominance and overweening authority, but rather through collaboration, through cooperation. And again, as you noted, I mean, these things can be dangerous when you start overly essentializing them, but at least in terms of a broad, he was clearly rethinking his ministry beyond at least a very, very problematic masculinity. So I don't want to over-represent, because I do think there are, you could say, men working at the grassroots as well, but I think at least the tendency of some of the themes I outlined there do not accord with the broad kind of masculine hegemony model of service, of leadership, even in politics. And I think that has to change in a way for you to see more at the grassroots. But I'll stop there. So.
I'm sorry, I need to give you my excuse, because when I am speaking in English, I always say the man. But in my mind, it's the human. No, I am not speaking about man like gender and the opposite way of woman. Sorry about that.
I have questions for each of you as well. Jeane, I'm wondering if in some of these women's groups, what people and women are dealing with women who may have suffered miscarriages and stillbirths and still view notions of mothering, so may not have a live child, but how does that fit? For James, I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Cars 3. Have you seen that movie with your daughter?
I have seen the first two.
Okay. So for anybody who is doing anything at the intersection of race and gender, I highly recommend Cars 3, but spoiler alert. At the end of Cars 3, Lightning McQueen, who's the main character, and he's like a big shot race car who has won for the first two movies, moves out of the way for a car who was seen as a trainer kind of person, because she was never seen as an actual racer. And so he ends up moving out of her way. And I show this in my classes to talk open discussion about solidarity. And so my question is, what does an image of that, like somebody who has had a dominant position and moves out of the way, how does that maybe fit with your notion of amplification? And then Emilce, I wonder if, so I do Latino-Latina theology, which also believes that we walk with and accompany people and communities, and there are communities where we have come from. And so we struggle many times with being both part of the community, but also having been taken out and having the education, the university education. So I wonder if you have any insight, either from psychology or from political theory, about how do you help people, or how do you think about being both part of a community, but outside of a community that continues to walk with and do research and theology with the community. Does that make sense?
I can understand the question.
Okay.
Which is the question?
Just the question. Le hago la pregunta en español. Ok, en español es si somos parte de la comunidad, pero también no somos parte de la comunidad. Las personas, los teólogos y las teólogas profesionales que están haciendo las investigaciones, si somos parte de la comunidad, que salimos de esta comunidad, pero también nos dieron la educación para... Entonces, con la educación ya no somos parte de la comunidad, al mismo tiempo que es la comunidad donde vivimos, de donde salimos. Les estoy preguntando si hay algunos estudios psicológicos de investigadores que hacen investigaciones sobre eso. Gracias.
Thank you for the question. It is really remarkable that the WKPRI, which is the Catholic women's movements in Indonesia, really does take care, of all women who are mothers. So whether they're married or single, and it's worth noting that even if these women are non-Catholics, whether they are Muslims or Hindus or indigenous peoples, because it's in their mission and vision, they're there to help women, as they've said, without exception. And the kind of model, and we've seen that even in their own logo and the mission statements and in their actions, really to help out those who are politically, even. So it's not just about the suffering of someone who has experienced stillbirth, but for me, what is really remarkable is that they are there to help those who are considered to be in the, maybe we can say, in the hierarchy of society, the housewives, to have a kind of political voice, and representation. So, so for them, that understanding of nurturing, not just only to take care of women who suffer, but really extends to giving women the ability to be able to vote and be politically represented, because their mission is really towards nation building, and not just to help those who suffer, but really to help in the formation of citizens who will contribute to the nation building. And part of, for them, the idea of a productive citizen is someone who is able to live with a diversity in community. It's something that is so integrated in their lives. So there's no such thing as ghettos or something like that, as John Pryor has noted in his observation of these, as he calls them, the Christian congregations in the Java area. So there really are living with diversity and living with all various kinds of people that they grow up with. These are neighbors, right? So I'm struck with in their vision mission statement, helping one another without exception. So not whether you're Catholic or you're not, whether you are married or a single mom or suffering. And so.
Well, to take the symbolic language, I have two examples okay. I have now two examples, two movies. One is an American movie, the name from the 70s, Blow Up. Do you remember that movie? Mm-hmm. Not the young, but the oldest, Blow Up?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
It's a classic and famous movie. And the actor, the principal role, is a photographer. And in the last essence, he was so depressive, and he went to the park in London, and there I was playing a tennis game, but mimos, not real players, mimos. Mimos is correct? Mimo? Mimes. And they have no ball. They was playing but with a ball. But they repeat all the movements like the ball was there. And the actor can understand what they was doing. And in one moment, the mime was threw the ball near him. And they was waiting for the ball. Do you remember? Okay, and they was waiting for the ball. And he said, "Ah, Christ, there is not a ball here." And the face of the mime began to be sad. And after the pressures for 2 minutes, the actor took the ball and threw the ball. And after that moment, he began to listen to the ball. Talk, 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 talk. That was the end of the great movie. And the topic of the movie is what you see. If you see a murder, but nobody, after you see that, nobody was killed. That is the topic of the movie. So, the second example that I remember is the gospel. When a young man asked Jesus how enter the kingdom. And he said, "Go, sell everything, and then come here." So, that is real, the conversion, what Francisco is speaking about. Conversion is not stay 2 hours at the church or become the... Conversion is cross a frontier. Across a frontier is not easy, because sometimes you must put down all your baggage. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's knowledge. Sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes all you have in your mind it's not easy to stay with people, with poor people, ignorant for us, and not to teach. It's not easy to move from that part. I don't know your particular case. Maybe you can do that after a PhD, after university. Maybe you and the sister here, maybe they understand better me what I am trying to say. But it's not easy, this movement. The frontier that we need to cross is inside the culture. The frontier is a discursive wall, a discursive wall. No, that is not easy. In that sense, I am trying to speak about this. We need another language, because if you are included, we are inside the dominant discourse. I promise you. If not, they push you outside. It's not easy to understand, but if you are here, you're inside. No, but I speak about the poor, the theology of the people. Forget. That is my opinion, of course.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you pointed to is one of the hardest things, which is to move out of the way. And I think often well-meaning people want to control things. I mentioned John Perkins, and I really recommend a book by Chris Rice called Grace Matters. And Chris Rice was a white volunteer, went down to Mississippi to work in this interracial community, worked closely with John Perkins' son, Spencer. And after about 5 years of being there, there's a recognition among the African American parishioners that basically these white volunteers were doing everything. And they were running it all. And so Spencer stood up one Sunday and said, "What the hell are all you white people doing here? Just go home. You know, you come down here and you just colonize this. You know, you're just doing this again." And it was a real shock for Chris and others, because they're like, "No, we're not. You know, we're just here to help. We're just trying to get things done." You know, and so I think you name it, because I think it's harder than we think to actually step back. I mean, it's hard enough for me just with my own children, much less when you're working, whether it's cross-culture, across class lines, or across power structures, and to allow to not control the outcome, and even to accept things going not the way that you want. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things, even you look at missionary history in the past and even up to the present, is kind of dealing with the fact that the reality, as you say, is greater than the idea that I brought to it, and that I can't control that, nor will people gain out of this unless they in some ways can do it themselves. And on the other hand, there's also the importance of training and other things. So I would say I think Radio Populist is trying to do that well by offering in some ways effective training, getting, not just abandoning people, but also allowing them to step forward and running programs. And I actually would highlight Sister Rosemary's initiative she talked about on Friday, which is to have a peace conference, again, not with UN experts, but with the women in the camps, from South Sudan, and to amplify their voices. I mean, Sister Rosemary has a network of people that voice will get out now because of the network, but it's not just going to be her voice, or just the voice of a few academics, but the actual voices of the women in the camps. So I think that is also a sense of using the privilege you have and recognizing that, but then, as you say, taking a step back to allow other voices to be heard. So, but thank you. I think you've nailed a really important point.
So I think it's time for a break. I'd like to thank our three speakers again.